Hey everyone, so I've actually been wanting to make this video for quite a while now. I wanted to go over how to completely take apart and reassemble a Balisong. I've seen a ton of other videos on Bali maintenance, but none I've found really cover the whole disassembly and reassembly process start to finish, or if they do, it might be focused on one specific Bali. So I thought it would be helpful to put together a more comprehensive tutorial and go over some of the issues you might encounter along the way and how to solve them. As someone who's been in this hobby for just about 10 years now, I've picked up a good amount of tips and tricks when working on Balis of all different types. So whether you're new to the community or been around for a while, there are probably some helpful little nuggets in here for just about everyone. I've also written a few articles on Bali maintenance, which are linked down in the description. But all this being said, I'm sure there are still some things I don't know, so please also comment below some of your own tips and tricks for Bali maintenance. Also, this is not the definitive only way to take apart a Balisong. This is just what I've found has been the easiest and most consistent way that works best for me. To keep things as informative and helpful as possible, I'll be working on everyone's favorite Bali to work on, the BRS Replicant. Reps are one of, if not the most common Balis to mod, but also one of the more complicated ones to take apart, so we'll be able to go over just about any problem you might have while taking apart any Bali. So let's start by looking at the tools I like to use. I have my maintenance kit, which is a BRS case with one of the foams taken out. This has my Torx driver set, Bali spindle, Teflon tape, pivot needle, lube, got my microfiber cloth, and also some of these micro swabs from KPL. I also have some paper towels, scissors, and some of KPL's knife shield. I'll link to all the products I'm using down in the description, and if you are picking up any KPL products, please make sure to use my affiliate code BARKHANDLE at checkout. I'd really appreciate it. You'll get a little discount, I'll get a little kickback, and you'll get yourself some really great products that I use all the time, so it's a win-win. So we're gonna start at the pivots, and there are already a few things you need to look out for before getting started here. First is that some Balis look like they have two sides to the pivot screws, but this is pretty rarely the case. Sometimes, like with the DDR Gemini, there are actually screws on both sides of this, but most of the time, one of the ends is actually going to be the other end of the sex bolt, which you do not want to try and unscrew since it won't actually get you anywhere. How to tell which side is the actual screw is that most of the time, you'll have the screws on the same side that the company logo is on the blade, or if you're holding it with the pivots up, the blade facing right. That should be your screw side. If someone put these in backwards or if they're flipped for whatever reason, you'll also be able to tell once you start unscrewing them because you'll feel extra resistance when turning the pivots. You'll also want to keep in mind that pivot screws almost always have one of three types of thread locker on them. Either Teflon tape, paracord, or a liquid chemical thread locker like Loctite. Screws that are thread locked with Teflon tape or paracord will be no problem. You'll just unscrew them like normal. But if the screws are Loctited, you may need to apply some heat to the pivot to help break that thread locker. I like to just hold the pivot a few inches over like a lighter for about 10 seconds, then try unscrewing it. You'll probably need to give it a decent amount of torque to initially break the thread locker, but once it's broken, you should be able to unscrew it the rest of the way pretty easily. If you're cranking too hard on it and the thread locker isn't breaking, try going back, adding a little bit more heat. Don't keep the pivot in the flame or on the flame, a little bit above it, and add a little more heat and then try again. Be really careful with this because if you apply too much torque without warming up the thread locker, you can snap your screw head off, and then you'll need to get the screw drilled out. So you want to start disassembly with the safe handle. Most Bali pivot screws will take a T10 Torx bit, but always make sure you're using the correct size bit or else you might strip your screw. I like to double check if I'm not sure by starting with a larger bit. If that doesn't fit, I'll just go one size smaller until it fits into the screw, and then you know that's the right size bit. Also, you want to make sure you're slightly pushing into the screw as you turn, and keep the driver as straight as possible. If you're not pushing in and keeping it straight, you just have a higher chance of slipping and stripping the screw. When you're unscrewing the pivot, squeeze both handles together while you're unscrewing, that's going to increase friction on the pivot sex bolt, which is going to hold it in place and prevent it from spinning while you're unscrewing. So once the screw is out, I'm going to drop it in the appropriate side of my bally spindle. You can see we've got an S for the safe handle side and a B for the bite handle side. And I'm also going to set up my toothpicks in my spindle now before I forget. And this is going to let us stack all of the handle components in a quick second here. Make sure everything goes back together exactly how it was. Then I'm just going to use my Torx bit to push the pivot through. Should come just right out here. If it doesn't come out that easily, you might need to loosen the Zen pins a little bit and then try pushing through again. If you are having a little trouble unscrewing the Zen pins, what you want to do is put pressure on the sides right underneath the pins right here. So I would squeeze right here, then try unscrewing. That's just going to put a little bit extra pressure on the pin itself, add a little friction, and let you unscrew those Zen pins a little bit more easily. And once my parts start coming out, I'll usually just give them a quick wipe down, get any extra oil or grease off of it. And then with the pivots, I'm also going to check on the inside for any extra thread locker or paracord or Teflon tape or anything. I typically use Teflon tape, so sometimes there's some stuck down in there. You'll want to get anything out of the pivot so you don't accumulate a bunch of stuff in there. Bally spindles come with these toothpicks, so I usually just stick a toothpick down in there. That'll help me get out some of the leftover residue, Teflon tape, paracord, or whatever. So once the pivot is out and clean, you can slide the handle off of the blade. Careful not to lose your washers or drop your bushing. And then I like to get everything stacked up on here, get both of my washers together. And then I can just drop them both right onto the bally spindle. That way I don't have to worry about or remember which was on top or on bottom, which way they were oriented. And then after that, I'll do the same. I'll just drop my bushing right onto there. That way I know they'll go right back into the same handle, same orientation, exactly how they were before. If you do lose track of which way your washers were oriented, BA Bally's has a really helpful video on how to tell which direction they're supposed to go, which I'll link in the description. I also clean my bushing and washers with a paper towel to get all the excess oil off of them. That way I don't have to do it later when I'm putting it all back together. To take apart the handles, you'll want to start with these end pins if your Bally has them. Both screws should unscrew pretty easily. If not, like I said before, you just want to squeeze them just below the Zen pins themselves. Give that a squeeze in either direction. That'll put a little extra friction on the pin itself and let you unscrew these a little bit more easily. Also, for one of the screws, I like to at least get it started, but I'm going to leave it slightly in because it can be a little tricky to get the Zen pin out at this step. So this will just make sure that it doesn't fall out and I don't lose it later when I take apart the rest of the scales and liners. So to take out the spacers, we're going to use a technique similar with the pivots where we put pressure on the sex bolts in here to add extra friction that'll allow you to unscrew the screws without the bolts spinning. So to do this, I'm going to separate the handles up here, and then I'm going to use my left hand to push the top ones in this direction, and I'm going to use the rest of my fingers to kind of pull the other handle slab in the other direction, which is going to put pressure and friction down here on these bolts, which is going to let these unscrew a lot more easily. I could just push my pivot bolts right through. Once that's done, I'm going to take these off. Now I'm going to finish off unscrewing the Zen pin. Just a couple more turns. Drop that in there, this in here, and now I'm going to, first I like to wipe off my handle components a little bit, especially at the pivots, and then I'm just going to stack these on the Bally spindle in the order they were taken apart in. That way I know exactly how to put it back together again. So at this step, I've got my washers, my bushing, my handle scales and liners all stacked up on the safe handle side of the bally spindle, and I've got all of my hardware for that side collected in that side too. We're gonna do the exact same process for the bite handle, but I just wanna mention the reason why we started with the safe handle is so when we're unscrewing this pivot, you can use the spine of the blade to squeeze together to create that friction like we did when we took apart the safe handle. If you did this the other way around, you'd be left squeezing the blade into the safe handle, which would be less than ideal. Obviously, it's not going to matter if you're working on a trainer, but it's a bit more of a problem if you have an actual live blade. So once everything is disassembled, if I haven't already, I like to go through and just clean everything off a little bit. For the handles, I typically just wipe them down with some paper towels, especially at the pivot areas like I did before. But my go-to for cleaning the blade is KPL's Knife Shield. Knife Shield not only acts as a cleaner, but helps to prevent rust. It works by doing a couple of sprays on a microfiber cloth or paper towel, and then just wipe it onto the blade. I'll usually wait for a little bit, and then if there's any excess, I'll just wipe that off. You can use this on, I think, whatever you want, metal, G10, but I know it works best on metals. I'll also use it on my titanium parts if they're a little extra dirty. So reassembly is largely going to be the same process, except in reverse, but with a few extra little thingies here and there. So I'll take my top ones off, and I'm going to start with my bottom scale and liner. I'm going to start by loosely screwing in the Zen pin from this side, just enough to hold it in place. Doesn't have to be super tight at this point. So once you got your Zen pin in a little bit, I like to put in my spacer pivots. Once that's on, you can drop your spacer on. Make sure your spacer is aligned correctly. If you put this on flipped backwards, you're gonna have to go all the way back to this step, which I can tell you from experience is not a great time. One way to think about it, sometimes you'll have little marks that'll kind of show you little scratches in the ano or whatever that'll make sure you're putting it on the same way again. But I always like to think about it as the spacer's gonna point to the side where the Zen pin is on. So then I'll put on the top liner, the top scale, again making sure everything lines up with the Zen pin. And I'm going to drop in my spacer screws. I'm going to put them in just a little bit at first to make sure that they're in and that they're threaded correctly. If they ever do feel like they're getting cross-threaded, like they're going in with some resistance, another trick is if you actually turn them back out until they line up, you'll kind of feel it, you'll get the feel for it the more you do it, and then you'll start screwing it back in the right way. But I'll get these in at least a little bit, and then I'm going to do that same trick I did to take them apart, where I push the top part in this direction, pull the bottom part in that direction, put extra pressure, extra friction on the on these pivot bolts here, or the spacer bolts rather, and then that way I can screw these in nice and tight. So you do want these screws to be nice and tight. You can't really go back to this step after you've done it because you won't be able to push the handles in opposite directions like we're doing now. So careful not to over tighten these, but you do want these to be nice and tight, nice and snug. This is what's gonna make the handle feel nice and solid once it's all put back together. If you do have one of these screws loose, you might get like a little bit of rattling, or it just might not feel super tight. So definitely make sure you're doing this step properly. So then you're gonna push that back to line up the Zen pin with the holes on the top handle. Then you can screw in your pins. And I'm actually not going to screw these in all the way just yet. I don't want to tighten these all the way down at this step. It's just going to make it a little bit easier to slide the handle back onto the blade when we get to that step, if these aren't super tight just yet. Before you put the handle back on the blade, do remember to put your bushing back in the blade if your Bali runs on bushings. And it is really important that the bushing goes back in the same side that it came from. Otherwise, it could mess up your tolerances and lead to tap, extra play, or even binding when you're trying to tune it. If you're using a Bali spindle, you'll know which one goes on which side, because we got B marked for bite side. But if you're not using one, just make sure you remember which one goes where. Definitely don't mix these up. So next, I like to position the handle kind of roughly where it's going to go over. And then I'm going to slide my washers in one at a time, about to where they need to go. This doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to line them all up later. And quick side note here, I know some people do prefer to hold the washers on the blade and then slide the handle over that. I've always found this to be a lot trickier and more frustrating, but maybe try both ways and go with whatever way you think is easier. I will say that if your Bali runs on bearings, I do find it a lot easier to hold the bearings onto the blade and then slide the handle over those. But with washers, I always slide them in after I have the handle and blade in position. So as everything is kind of generally in position, it doesn't even have to be close to perfect, because that's what we'll do in the next step. For this, we need to line everything up. I like just grabbing my toothpick I was just using. You can stick that through, make sure it catches everything, and then just a couple of swirls around in the pivot area is going to just kind of line everything up, and it should make it easy to just push the pivot right on through. If you feel it gets stuck at any point, usually just kind of a few wiggles will help push the pivot through, as long as it's lined up close enough. Also, do remember to push the pivot through from the correct side so that the screw will end up on the same side it started on, typically going to be the side with the blade stamp. Before you put your pivot screws in, you'll probably want to use some type of thread locker. Personally, I do not recommend using Loctite or any liquid chemical thread locker. These have a cure time of usually 24 hours, which means you'll have to wait a full day before being able to use or flip your Bali. And honestly, I've had mixed success with thread locker anyway. Sometimes it's broken after just a few drops. Teflon tape and paracord are both really great alternatives to Loctite. Personally, I use Teflon tape just because I think it's a little easier to work with. But a lot of people swear by paracord, and the times I have used it, it's been really effective at keeping screws in place. I'm not going to go really deep into how to use Teflon tape. I will link a couple videos in the description for how to do that. But basically, you just wrap the screw about 4 to 5 times around in the tape, making sure you're wrapping it in the direction in which it'll get screwed in, so wrapping it clockwise. You'll cut off any excess and then just screw the pivot in, and remembering to squeeze the handles together so that it doesn't just spin the whole assembly. If you do want to use paracord as a thread locker, I'll also link a couple of videos below with a couple different methods on how to do that. So last thing, before you forget, you want to just tighten up those Zen pins, making sure not to over tighten them. Make sure they're tight enough to really stay in there. And there you go. Now one handle's done. Just repeat the exact same process for the other handle and you're almost home free. So for the safe handle, I'm going to show you how to use the pivot needle from Indiana John. Basically, this is just a little bit of an easier, speedier way to line up everything in the pivots, kind of do everything automatically. So again, we'll start with the bushing, slide my handle on, slide in the washers one at a time. Now, on the pivot needle, you put, the pivot will just fit right on the back of that. Start threading the needle through, make sure the needle goes through all of the different parts, and then everything will line up automatically. Just push the pivot right through, pivot needle pops out, and the pivot's in. I'm screwing in my last pivot screw, finish up by tightening the Zen pins, and we're on to our final steps. So the last two steps are to tune your bally and oil the pivots. Tuning basically involves tightening the pivot screws as much as possible while still allowing for the handles to swing freely. With bushings and bearings, you should be able to tighten the screws down pretty much all the way and still have your handles swing free, at least as long as the bushings are sized properly. With ballies that run on washers, you'll want to tighten until the handle binds and then slowly back out the screw, testing the handle, slowly back it out until the handle swings free. And once everything is back together, just apply a drop of oil on each side of the blade, on each pivot. Work it in a little bit. And then you're ready to flip. So please comment below any questions you might have or any maintenance tips of your own. Give this video a like and a share if you found it helpful. I'd highly recommend picking up a bally spindle anytime you're working on any of your ballies, not just because it's my product, but because it was literally born out of my frustrations with this whole process. And as you probably saw, it makes things way easier in more ways than one. Also, don't forget to use code BARKHANDLE for any KPL products you pick up. I've been using their knife shield for about 2 years now, and their oil for even longer. And these micro swabs are really, really great for cleaning, especially getting down into that little crack between the pivots there. So that's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching. Eat your vegetables and keep flipping.